My wife was hiding a shocking secret. She was with my best friend. At that moment, I realized something was wrong. Julia stood beside me, her gaze sweeping across the room but avoiding my eyes. What she said next turned my world upside down. It all started on an ordinary evening. Julia and I were having dinner, and the night seemed like it would be peaceful. She laughed at my terrible jokes, and I felt like the happiest man alive. But then everything changed. An old photo album that Julia had accidentally brought from the bedroom caught my attention. We flipped through the pages until I saw a photo I'd never seen before. Julia stood next to a man who looked oddly familiar. He was holding her hand, and her smile was filled with tenderness. "Who is this?" I asked, pointing at the picture. Julia tensed, her smile fading. "That's an old friend," she replied, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. "What's his name?" "Mike," she said, lowering her eyes. The name hit me like a bolt of lightning. Mike was my best friend, my brother in life. We grew up together, shared all our secrets. And now I was learning they had been together? "Did you date?" Julia took a deep breath. "Yes," she admitted. "It was before I met you. But it's ancient history. It doesn't mean anything anymore." I wanted to believe her, but her trembling hands and nervous demeanor told a different story. Something else was hidden. At that moment, my phone buzzed. A message. From Mike. "We need to talk. It's important." I felt my blood run cold. Did he know what I had just discovered? Julia moved closer, wrapping her arms around mine and whispering softly, "Before you go to him, you need to know the truth. Everything." What Julia said wasn't just a blow. It felt like the ground had collapsed beneath me. I knew she was hiding something serious, but I had no idea how deep this went. I felt her fingers gripping my arm tightly. Her eyes held a mix of fear and desperation. She wanted to speak, but it seemed like she was battling her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. "Going to Mike? It would be a mistake," she began. Her voice was quiet but firm. I tried to pull my arm away, but she wouldn't let go. "Julia, I need to know. If it's true, if there was something between you two, why didn't you tell me? Why am I finding out now?" She took a deep breath and seemed to gather the courage to say more. "We weren't just dating," she said, lowering her eyes. "It was more than a brief romance. We had a connection." My chest tightened with pain. "What do you mean?" "I was in love with him," she confessed. Her words cut like a knife, each one deeper than the last. "We were together for years, and even after it ended." She trailed off. What happened after it ended? She didn't answer. Her silence spoke louder than any words. I realized this was more than just a forgotten past. "Tell me everything, Julia. Right now." She sat beside me, her head bowed. Mike was the first man I had a relationship with. We lived together, shared everything. But it all fell apart. His betrayals, they left scars. I decided to move on, and that's when I met you. But Mike, he didn't let it go. "What do you mean?" She lifted her head and looked me straight in the eyes. "He kept writing to me, even after we got married. He came to see me, trying to win me back." "And what did you say to him?" My words came out sharp, almost uncontrollable. "Nothing. I never let myself cross the line." Her words sounded sincere, but I could feel there was more left unsaid. My phone buzzed again. It was Mike. Another message. "This is important. If you don't come, you'll lose your chance to know the truth." "I can't ignore this," I said, standing up. Julia grabbed my hand. "Before you go, you need to know that he might tell you things that will make you doubt me. But remember, I love you, and I have never betrayed you." Her words echoed in my mind, but I had already made up my mind. She reached out to stop me, but I stepped away and grabbed my phone. Mike was waiting. At the door, I turned back, and in her eyes, I saw not just fear but the shadow of a secret. I sat across from Mike in a nearly empty bar. His eyes were filled with confidence, but there was also a hint of pain. His first words felt like a bucket of ice water poured over me. "You don't know who your wife really is," Mike said, leaning closer to me. "And what's that supposed to mean?" I replied, trying to stay composed. Mike smirked, but it was the smile of someone who knew something you didn't. Julia isn't the woman you think she is. I'm not denying that you love her, but you deserve to know what happened between us. I felt the glass of beer sweating under my fingers, but I tried not to lose my calm. Then speak, I said. Mike took a deep breath, as if preparing for a long monologue. We were more than just lovers. We had a connection that went beyond the ordinary. She was passionate, open, fearless. Can you imagine that version of Julia? I looked away, but his words pierced through me like sharp knives. We spent countless nights together, exploring ourselves. He paused, carefully choosing his words. I won't go into details, but I'll say this. We did things that leave a mark. Why are you telling me this? I finally blurted out. What are you trying to prove? Mike leaned back and shook his head. Because she'll never forget what we had. And you need to know that. She might say she's moved on, but I see how she looks at me. It's not just the past. My hands clenched into fists, but I forced myself not to react. Is that all? I asked coldly. Mike smiled again, but now there was anger in his eyes. You want to know everything? Then I'll tell you this. The last time I saw her, she wasn't just talking to me. She touched me, and that was after your wedding. I stood up abruptly, the chair screeching against the floor. You're lying. Am I? Mike pulled out his phone and opened the gallery. See for yourself. He handed me the phone. On the screen was a photo that made my blood run cold. Julia, smiling, leaning toward him, their faces far too close. She's not yours, buddy. She's ours, Mike said, looking me straight in the eye. I felt anger boiling inside me, but alongside it was something else. Doubt. Mike put his phone away and added, if you want to know more, ask her. But remember, I'll always be a part of her life. When I returned home, Julia was sitting on the couch. She looked like she already knew what I had heard from Mike. Her eyes filled with tears before I could even say a word. What she said next tore me apart from the inside. I walked into the living room, breathing heavily, trying to collect my thoughts. Julia immediately stood up but didn't approach me. Her arms were crossed over her chest, her face frozen in tense anticipation. You spoke to him, didn't you? She asked softly, almost whispering. What did he mean? I ignored her question. Is it true that you met him after our wedding? She lowered her head. It was only once. He came to me. We just talked, her voice trembled, and she seemed to wrestle with memories she didn't want to relive. I couldn't make him leave. Talked? I felt my voice rising. Talked? Do you understand how this looks, Julia? She suddenly lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. I know how it looks, but I didn't do anything that could harm our marriage. And the photo? I stepped closer, clutching the phone in my hand. What can you say about this? I showed her the photo Mike had sent me. Her face turned pale. That was after our wedding, but nothing happened. Her voice was filled with desperation. We talked about the past. He said he still loves me. I told him I love you and asked him not to come back. And you think I should believe that? She stepped toward me, her hands trembling. That's why I wanted to tell you everything earlier, but I was afraid. Mike has always been a complicated chapter for me, but he is the past. The past? I felt the anger rising in me. If he's the past, then why haven't you blocked him? Why can he still send me messages that destroy everything I believed in? Julia dropped her hands. I'm afraid of him, she whispered. Those words stopped me in my tracks. What do you mean? Mike has never left me alone. He's been stalking me, saying that if I don't come back to him, he'll destroy everything we have. I stayed silent because I was scared you'd do something irreversible, and now you decided to stay silent about this? I felt the mixed emotions of betrayal and pity tearing me apart. She moved closer and touched my hand. Please, believe me. I haven't betrayed you. He's trying to destroy us. Before I could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and suddenly went pale. It's him, she said, showing me the phone with the name Mike on the screen. Her confession about an unresolved past made me feel like I was teetering on the edge of an abyss. I didn't know if I could trust her after this, but her words, like a bullet hitting its mark, made me stop and listen. What do you mean by something unresolved? I barely held back the anger rising in my voice. Julia stood in the middle of the room, her gaze shifting between me and the phone still vibrating in her hand. Finally, she silenced the call and quietly said, "I can't say he's completely out of my life. I thought I could forget, but it's not that simple." Forget? Forget what? My words were sharp, but there was also worry in them. She sank onto the couch, clutching her head in her hands. Forget what I felt for him, who he was to me. Mike isn't just a part of my past. He was the first person who shaped me into who I am. What are you trying to say? I stepped closer, feeling my heart tighten with every word she spoke. Julia looked at me, her eyes filled with deep sadness. We were together during the hardest time of my life. He knew me in ways you don't. I'm not saying it's right, but a part of me is still tied to him. I felt the ground beneath me becoming increasingly unstable. Do you love him? The question slipped out before I could stop myself. She lowered her eyes. No, but I can't say I feel nothing. It's complicated. Complicated? I felt anger and resentment boiling inside me. What about me? Did you think about how this feels for me? Julia lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. I know I've hurt you, but listen to me. I love you. You're my husband, my partner. But the past, it's not so easy to erase. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Her words sounded sincere, but they left me hollow. And now what? What are you proposing? She stepped closer, her hands touching mine. Give me a chance to prove I've chosen you. But to do that, you need to understand that I can't ignore this situation anymore. We need to deal with Mike together. Together? I stepped back. You want me to sit by while you decide who you really want to be with? Julia shook her head. No. I want you to be with me while we close this chapter for good. Her phone rang again. This time, she didn't silence it but pressed the answer button. Mike, I can't keep playing these games. We need to end this. I stood there, listening to every word, knowing that the next conversation would change everything. When we reached the point where Mike agreed to meet, I already knew it wouldn't be easy. Julia stood beside me, her face pale as snow, her eyes filled with fear. But the words Mike said when he saw us both forever changed my perception of this story. We agreed to meet at an old motel outside the city. It was the place where, according to Julia, they had spent a lot of time together when they were a couple. The irony of the situation weighed heavily on me. I was going to the place where their relationship began to end it once and for all. When we entered the room, Mike was already there. He looked as if he was completely confident, but there was a certain bitterness hidden in his smile. His eyes immediately fixed on Julia, as if I wasn't even there. How sweet, he said, gesturing for us to sit. You came together to sort things out with me? I remained silent, letting Julia start the conversation. This has to stop, Mike, she said, her voice firm even though her hands trembled slightly. You can't keep interfering in our lives. Our lives, Mike repeated with a bitter smile. Did you forget that we had our lives too? Or have you decided to erase those years? Julia lowered her eyes, but I saw her jaw clench. Mike, I'm grateful for those times. But that was a long time ago. I'm with Alex now, and I love him. Love him? Mike leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You say it like our nights together meant nothing. Do you remember how you were with me? How you said you'd never love anyone the way you loved me? I felt my fist clench. That's enough, Mike, I said, trying to keep my composure. You're not here to reminisce about the past. We're here to put an end to this. Mike stood up and stepped closer to us. His gaze once again locked onto Julia. And you? Do you want to close this too? Can you honestly say you feel nothing when you look at me? Julia raised her head, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was firm. I feel regret. Regret for letting you have so much control over me for so many years. Mike laughed, but it was hollow. Regret? Then why can't you forget our nights together? Why do you still remember how I touched you? How you begged me never to let you go? Those words hit me like a punch to the chest. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Enough, I shouted, standing up. This isn't about the two of you anymore. It's about the fact that you can't accept that she chose me. Mike looked at me defiantly. Chose? She chose you? Then explain why she hasn't blocked my number. Why did she answer when I called? I turned to Julia. Is that true? She closed her eyes, a sob escaping her lips. I didn't mean to. I was afraid it would destroy everything. You already destroyed it, I said, feeling despair turning into anger. Suddenly, Mike pulled out his phone and opened a video. He held the screen up so we both could see. The video showed Julia in the same room, months ago. She was standing close to him, and their conversation was intimate. He touched her face, and she didn't pull away. I told you she's ours, Mike whispered, staring directly at me. Julia rushed toward me, but I raised my hand to stop her. Tell me this isn't what it looks like, I said, feeling everything around me crumble. Her silence was answer enough. When Mike handed me the phone with the video, it felt like my world shattered into pieces. But his next words opened a new, even darker chapter of this story. Julia stepped closer to me, her eyes full of desperation. Alex, it's not what you think. Not what I think. I pointed at Mike's phone screen. Then tell me what it is, because it seems pretty clear to me. It was a mistake. Her voice trembled, but I could tell there was more she wasn't saying. A mistake? Mike laughed mockingly. Julia, tell him. Tell him what else really happened. I turned to Julia, my eyes demanding only one thing. Speak. Are you listening to him again? She held her head in her hands. Alex, I love you. That's not an answer. I couldn't hold back my anger anymore. Mike stepped forward, his smile sharp. You still think there was nothing between us? I get it. You want to believe in the fairy tale. But here, let me show you what reality looks like. He pulled out his phone again and opened another video. This time, the footage was much more intimate. Julia was sitting next to him, his hand resting on her shoulder. Their conversation was quiet but unmistakable. I'll always be special to you, right? Mike asked. You know you will, she replied, her voice soft, almost a whisper. My hands trembled. How do you explain this? I asked, my words barely audible. Alex, it's not. I was confused, she started. Confused? Mike laughed again. That's perfect. But there's one more thing you need to know, Alex. I looked at him. What else? Mike leaned in closer, his voice turning serious. I didn't come back into her life by accident. I have something that belongs to both her and me. What do you mean? I asked. He paused, then said, a child. My eyes widened, and my heart stopped. What? I turned to Julia, who now looked utterly devastated. It's not true, she cried. Alex, it's not true. Then tell him, Mike interjected. Tell him why I might think that. Why I have a reason to believe the child is mine. I looked at her, feeling the last threads of trust unraveling before my eyes. I'm waiting, I said. Julia closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling. It's true, she whispered, but I don't know whose it is. My head spun. What? It happened once. Her voice was barely audible. You were away on a business trip. And I was weak. He took advantage of that. Took advantage? Mike stepped closer. Don't make yourself out to be the victim, Julia. We both know it was mutual. I couldn't take it anymore. Enough. I shouted. It's all clear now. No, Alex. Julia grabbed my hand. Please, don't go. I love you. I pulled my hand away and turned to her. Love me? Then why am I hearing this from him and not you? I walked toward the door, but Mike threw out one last challenge. If you want the whole truth, I can do a DNA test. Can you handle the result? When I heard Mike's words, it felt like my blood froze. A DNA test? The answer that could change everything was right in front of me. But what lay ahead promised to be even more difficult. The silence in the room was so thick it felt suffocating. Julia stood with her hands pressed to her chest, her face pale. Mike looked at me with a faint smile, savoring the control he held over the situation. You want to know the truth, don't you? His voice was quiet, but each word hit like a hammer. I couldn't speak. My heart pounded in my chest, but my mind was blank. Fine, I finally said, steadying my voice. The test. Let's do it. Julia sobbed, and I looked at her. Alex, please, it's not what you think. I can't think anymore, Julia. Just facts, I replied, trying to remain cold, though everything inside me was boiling. Mike stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with triumph. I'll handle it, he said. I know someone who can set it up. It won't take long. And then what? I asked, glaring at him with hatred. What do you gain if you're right? This isn't about me, Mike replied. It's about the fact that she still can't let go. Julia lifted her head. You have no right to say that, her voice cracked, but there was anger in it. I made a mistake, but that doesn't give you the right to ruin our lives. Mike just smiled. We'll see who's ruining your life when the truth comes out. The following days were the hardest of my life. We barely spoke to each other. Julia tried to talk, but I couldn't. Every glance at her reminded me of Mike's words, his videos, her silence. The DNA test was scheduled for the end of the week. Mike was confident he was right, but I clung to the faint hope that it was just another one of his manipulations. Alex, Julia said one evening as we sat at the table, I know you think I betrayed you, but Mike has always been a master manipulator. That doesn't absolve you of responsibility, I replied. She nodded, her gaze filled with pain. I know, but I want you to know. I chose you, no matter what the test shows. And if it shows the child is his? I asked. She covered her face with her hands, as if afraid to answer. I don't know, she said, but I want you to know. I love you. I couldn't respond. My emotions were too overwhelming. The day of the test arrived. We met at the clinic where everything had been arranged. Mike was there, his confidence seemingly unshakable. Regardless of the results, he said as we waited for the doctor, you know you'll never be to her what I was. Go to hell, I replied coldly. The doctor called us into the office, and the procedure was quick. The samples were taken, and now all we could do was wait. A few days later, I received a call from the clinic. The results were ready. I stood in the hallway as I heard. The results show that you are not the biological father of the child. My fingers went slack, and the phone fell to the floor. I turned to see Julia standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with fear and pain. We need to talk, she said. When the results confirmed the worst, I stood before her, feeling everything we had built together crumble before my eyes. But her next words, filled with pain and tears, changed not only how I saw this situation, but also how I saw myself. The phone slipped from my hand, its screen cracking on the floor, but I didn't care. All I could hear was the echo in my mind. You are not the biological father of the child. Julia stood in the doorway, her face frozen in horror. Her hands trembled, and tears streamed down her cheeks. Alex, her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. It's not what you think. Not what I think. My voice broke. How am I supposed to understand this, Julia? You betrayed me. She stepped forward, but I raised my hand to stop her. Don't. Now you're going to tell me everything. I don't want any more lies. It was a mistake, she sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I was confused. You were gone, and I felt lonely. Lonely? My voice was bitter. And that's why you went back to him? Julia sank onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs. I know it was wrong, she said, gasping for air between words. But it only happened once. I wanted to stop it, but I was weak. I stood still, trying to gather my thoughts. Her tears, her despair. They seemed genuine, but I couldn't find the strength to believe her. And how long did it go on? I looked at her. How many times did you see him behind my back? It was only once after our wedding. She raised her head, her eyes meeting mine. And after that, I ended it. I told him I loved you. But you never told me. I crossed my arms. You hid it for years. She covered her face with her hands, her sobs growing louder. I was afraid it would destroy us. And you thought it would stay a secret? I felt my voice rising. She lifted her head, her gaze full of pain. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, she said, but I'm asking you. Give me a chance to make this right. Make it right. I laughed, but it was hollow. How are you going to fix this, Julia? She stood, her face streaked with tears. I'll do whatever it takes. I love you, Alex. Love me? I shook my head. If you love me, why did you put our marriage at risk? I was foolish. Her voice was filled with despair. But I never stopped loving you. And what about Mike? I asked. What do you feel for him? She lowered her head, and for a moment, the room was silent. I don't feel anything for him anymore. He's the past I want to leave behind. But that past is now in our lives. I stepped closer. And you let him in. Her tears began to fall again. I know, she said. But if you give me a chance, I'll prove to you that it was a mistake I'll never make again. I stood before her, feeling anger and love battling within me. She had made a mistake, but could I leave it all behind? At that moment, the door swung open. Mike stood on the threshold, his face serious. If you're done with your confessions, he said, there's something else you need to know. The door opened, and Mike entered with the air of a victor. Julia flinched as if hit by a cold wind, and I stood there, fists clenched. His next words overturned everything I thought I knew about this situation. Mike stopped in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over me and Julia like a predator assessing its prey. You two make such a sweet picture, he began sarcastically. But there's something you both need to hear. We've heard enough, Mike, I said coldly. You have no reason to be here anymore. Oh, I wouldn't say that, friend, his smile widened. Julia, why don't you tell him about our last meeting? I glanced at Julia, who looked as though she might collapse. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, trying to remain calm, but her voice trembled. Oh, really? Mike tilted his head. Want me to remind you? He pulled out his phone and opened another video. On the screen was Julia, standing next to Mike in the same room we had been in a few days ago. She looked nervous, his hand resting on her shoulder. You told me you wanted to talk about the child, he began, looking directly at her. Now tell your husband what happened next. Stop it, Mike. Julia stepped toward him, but he raised a hand to stop her. He deserves to know, Mike said. I turned to Julia. Tell me, I said, feeling my heart tighten. She lowered her head again. I wanted to make sure he wouldn't interfere in our lives, she began. But what? I asked, my patience wearing thin. He said he would ruin me if I didn't meet with him. I want to try and end it. And that's all? I felt my anger rising. That's all that happened? She didn't answer, but Mike smiled like a snake. Tell him about our little secret, Julia, he said, his voice dripping with challenge. There is no secret, she shouted. No? Then what about this? Mike pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. What is that? I asked, focusing on the flash drive. It's everything needed to destroy her reputation, Mike said. All the details of her work, our messages, videos. If this goes public, she'll lose everything. Her job, her reputation, and maybe even you. I looked at Julia, who now appeared utterly broken. You kept this? She asked, her voice filled with despair. Oh, yes, Mike replied. And now it's my insurance. You're blackmailing her? I stepped toward Mike, feeling the anger boil inside me. Call it what you want, he said, standing his ground. But if you want this to stay between us, I have my conditions. Mike extended the flash drive toward me. You can take this and think you've won. But if you take her back, you'll have to make a choice. Are you ready to live with the truth she's been hiding from you? Julia collapsed to her knees, crying, while I stood there, facing the biggest decision of my life. Mike stood before me, holding the flash drive, his confidence hitting me like the wind before a storm. Julia fell to her knees, her tears a silent plea for forgiveness. But this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about a choice that would determine everything. I stared at the flash drive, now a symbol of our shattered life. Mike smiled, as though he'd already won. But I knew, if he truly won, it meant I'd lost not just the fight but myself. What's on it? I asked, my words cold as ice. Everything you'd want to know, Mike replied, twirling the flash drive in his hand. Videos, messages, even recordings of our intimate moments. I felt my chest tighten, my hands instinctively clenched into fists. Intimate moments? I repeated, turning to Julia. She couldn't lift her head. That was a long time ago. Her voice was barely audible. A long time ago? I took a step closer to her. What do you call a long time? A week? A month? Or was it when you said it was all over? Julia raised her head, her eyes glistening with tears. It was when you went on your business trip, she said, her voice trembling. I was weak. Weak. I felt anger boiling inside me. And you let him do this? I didn't want it to go this far. Her words were filled with despair. He was persistent, and I couldn't say no. Mike just smiled. Couldn't say no? That's not what you told me that night. I turned to him, my eyes filled with hatred. Shut up, Mike. Why? Don't you want to hear the truth? I'm just helping her be honest, he smiled, but there was malice in his eyes. I stepped forward, but Julia stopped me. Alex, please, don't do this. Don't do this. I turned to her. You want me to just forget about it? About what you did? I made a mistake, but I never stopped loving you. She reached out, but I stepped back. Loving me? My voice was bitter. You let him destroy us. Mike stepped forward. Us? You two were never in us. She's always been a part of my life, even when you thought she was yours. Shut up, Mike. I clenched my fists, but Julia stopped me again. Alex, please. Her voice was soft. This is all my fault. Don't let him manipulate you. Mike tilted his head. Manipulate? You told me you missed the times when everything was simpler. Do you remember that, Julia? It wasn't what you think. She raised her eyes to me. I didn't want him back. You just what? I stepped back, feeling each of her words deepen the pain. I was lonely, she said. You were always busy, and I felt like you were drifting away. And that's why you turned to him? I glanced at Mike. I didn't know what I was doing. I was confused. Her words sounded like a desperate plea. You knew exactly what you were doing, Mike said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And you liked it. I couldn't take it anymore. Shut up, I yelled, stepping toward him. Mike raised his hands. All right, buddy. You can take this flash drive if you want. But remember my words. You'll never forget what you see. I grabbed the flash drive, but a sense of dread grew inside me. What would I find on it? And could I live with it? At home, I plugged the flash drive into my laptop. The video started playing. What I saw made me catch my breath. Julia was standing next to Mike in a hotel room. Her voice was quiet, but I could make out the words. I can't keep doing this, Mike. This has to end. But you know you'll come back to me, he said, touching her hand. Her response made me shudder. I'm not sure. When I connected the flash drive to my laptop, my hand trembled. I didn't know what I would find, but I understood one thing. This would change everything. And what I saw revealed a web of lies and manipulation far deeper than I could have imagined. The screen displayed dozens of files, videos, photos, emails, text messages. I nervously scrolled through them, my heart pounding as if anticipating disaster. The first files were about Julia. Images of her with Mike, their correspondence. They didn't seem overly provocative, but every word, every frame unsettled me. I can't keep doing this, Mike. I'm married. You always said I was the only one who truly understood you, Julia. I read those words, feeling my heart tighten. But what followed was even worse. In one of the videos, Julia and Mike were in the same hotel room. The camera was positioned to capture the entire space. Her voice sounded nervous, yet resolute. This has to end. You can't interfere in my life anymore. I'm just getting started, Julia, Mike replied, stepping closer to her. And you know it. In the video, Mike reached for her hand, and she stepped back. Her face was filled with anxiety. I love Alex, she said, trying to maintain distance. You love him? What about that night? What did you say then? She didn't respond, only closing her eyes. I paused the video, unable to watch further. But among the files, there was one that had nothing to do with Julia. I opened it, and everything became clear. The video featured another woman, someone I didn't recognize. Her conversation with Mike was eerily similar to what I had just seen. You have no right to do this, Mike. I told you it's over. Have no right? I can ruin your life if I want to. Mike used the same tactics with her as he had with Julia. He wasn't just manipulating her. He had turned it into a system. I opened a few more videos. Each time, A different woman appeared on the screen. Their stories were similar. Mike manipulated them, used them, and blackmailed them with compromising material. I felt rage boiling inside me. This wasn't just about Julia anymore. Mike was destroying the lives of many people. I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned off the laptop and looked at Julia, who was sitting in another room wrapped in a blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Mike didn't just do this to you," I said. She lifted her head, looking at me in surprise. "What do you mean?" "It's not just you, Julia. This is his scheme. And now we need to decide what to do next." After reviewing the materials on the flash drive, I felt a mix of fury and determination. This wasn't just a fight for our marriage anymore. It became a fight for truth and justice. "We can't let this go," I told Julia, who sat beside me with her head bowed. She raised her eyes, her gaze filled with regret and hope. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes, Alex." We decided not just to confront Mike, but to gather evidence of his actions and involve other women who had been his victims. I went through the flash drive again, this time with a different purpose. Every file, every video became a piece of our plan. A few days later, we met with one of the women from the videos. Her name was Sarah. She agreed to help when she realized we had also been victims of Mike's manipulations. "He's been doing this for years," she said, lowering her eyes. "But I was too scared to stand up to him." "You're not alone anymore," Julia replied, her voice filled with determination. We gathered testimonies from other women. Each of their stories was unique, but they all shared one thing: the fear and pain Mike had left behind. Mike found out about our actions. He showed up outside our house late at night, his face twisted with anger. "You have no idea who you're messing with," he said, glaring at me. "We know more than you think," I replied. "If you go any further, you'll lose everything." He leaned in closer. "Your job, your reputation, even her. You've already done everything to destroy that." I pointed to Julia, who stood beside me. "But now, you have no power over us." His gaze shifted to Julia. "And you believe him? After everything we had?" "Yes," her voice was firm. "I believe him more than ever." We handed the evidence over to the police and journalists. Mike could no longer hide his actions. He was arrested for blackmail and manipulation. The testimonies of the women were crucial, and his reputation was destroyed. After everything, Julia and I were faced with a difficult choice. "I know I hurt you," she said, her eyes full of tears, "but I'm ready to fight for us." "So am I," I replied. We began rebuilding our relationship, working on trust and understanding. It wasn't easy, but every day became a step forward. A year later, I sat in our living room, holding Julia's hand. Our marriage had weathered the storm, and we had grown closer than ever. Mike could no longer harm anyone else. His arrest served as a lesson to anyone who thought manipulation could go unpunished. "We did it," Julia said, her voice filled with warmth. "We did it together," I replied. This story wasn't an easy one, but it taught us something important. True love can withstand even the strongest storm if both are willing to fight for it. What do you think? Can a marriage survive such a crisis? Would you be able to forgive betrayal if you knew your partner was ready to make things right? Share your thoughts in the comments.